the job of a leader through uncertain times is to add more truth in the world. And truth is not spinning. Truth is, here's what we know, here's what we don't know. And so I've seen this multiple times at startups where you get out of an all hands and it's like the feeling is like things are great. And it's like, what happened? Why did we blew that messaging? Things are not great.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the HR Heretics podcast, where we get into the real talk of company construction. These are the conversations that happen between founders, chief people officers, and board members behind closed doors.
We're heretics in this industry because there's a culture of silence around important business topics, especially with people. But on the show, we tell the truth and expect the same from our guests. Today, we're so excited to introduce you to David Hanrahan. David is the chief people officer at Flare.
This was a good one, Nolan. I have known David for years and years. I mean, he's kind of like a brother at this point, and I call him like the professor. I don't know. He's just always been so like thoughtful and cerebral around HR topics and leading teams and company culture. He just puts it all together with EA and Twitter, onto Zendesk, Niantic, Eventbrite. I mean, these are amazing companies that he's been a part of, and it was great to talk to him about how he applied all that through his journey.
You're exactly right that David is cerebral, and I love David because he's no fluff and no bullshit. We got into some really interesting discussions around how he thinks about compensation and how it should be entirely around top performers. I loved his discussion around his personal experience with burnout and how he needed to take time back to reset. I don't find most people are as authentic as David.
Yeah. He just kind of is what it is, and just question, answer, and has a sense of humor along the way. So it's really entertaining. But he was very transparent about how he changed too in his HR career from early on, and how he would push his agenda and approach his work, and how he's kind of came over the hump and thinks about that pretty differently.
You can tell how comfortable David is in his skin by how authentic he is. And I just appreciate him being in the seat and still being okay with getting into the juicier and meatier topics. And I just think he is one of the best people at the job.
Yeah, agreed.
So without further ado, here's David.
David, thanks for joining me and Kelly today. We're super excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
All right, I want to start with the burnout question in people ops. Like, there's a lot of conversation around people leaders feeling burnt out post-COVID. My question is, do you feel like people leaders have gotten a little soft?
Yes. I can speak from my experience. I definitely got soft. I left my last gig because I was burnt out, and I said, "There's something wrong here." I told my boss in a one-on-one one day, about 2 years ago, literally 2 years ago, where I said, "You know what? I think I'm done." And she said, "What do you mean you're done? Are you done with this topic we're talking about?" And I'm like, "No, I think I'm done with my career." Like, in the moment, it was just like a light bulb moment of like, I don't have anything left in the tank. And now looking back on it, at that time, what was floating around me was CPO burnout. And I'm like, started thinking about to myself, like, I'm burnt out. This is like, I'm in that group. I'm in this group. And it was sort of self-perpetuating in a sense. And I stepped away from the work. I remember I told my wife after the call, I'm like, I think I just resigned. She's like, "What are you going to do?" And I'm like, I think I'm going to like meditate and like mountain bike and stuff. So speaking of soft, like I was definitely
silent retreats.
Silent retreats.
Well, I remember your LinkedIn post. You were doing film photography.
Yes. I took film classes. And what I would say is, for me, the time was super impactful to get back to the mode I think I'm in right now, which is like, I feel like, for lack of better words, a little bit more hard edge. Like, I feel a little bit more like I'm fired up. I feel like I'm, 10 to 15 years ago in my career, where like everything I was doing had me fired up, and like nothing phases me now. I don't know why, but like the time away refilled my tank. And so when I have a bad day, I just feel super resilient to it now. And so when I see the headlines around me of so-and-so is burnt out or so-and-so stepping away, I'm like, I remember what they were going through, but I did what I needed to do to kind of get into a more resilient space.
Yeah. David, you've had 20 plus years as opposed to when you had 10 plus years. Do you care about different things now?
I feel as though earlier in my career, I was a little bit more passionate about pet projects, things that like I was a novel concept of something I read in an HBR article or TechCrunch of like, oh yeah, I want to iterate on that, and just, removed from what business needs were. I just had a little thing I was going to bring to Zendesk, or a little sort of like a personal branding of like, I'm going to be all about this thing here. And maybe just like sort of time, experience, I don't know, wisdom, whatever you want to call it. I've realized that it's not about bringing your personal passion projects to your work, but like deeply understanding where is your company currently at? What are some of the sensibilities of the leaders? And some of them might not align with like things that I believe in, but hopefully on balance, most of them do. And I'm going to find a way for us to sort of make something work for us here on our compensation approach, on our performance approach, on sort of the employee experience, things that I maybe would have never thought about bringing to Zendesk. We're going to go deep on these to make sure we're really aligned as leaders on them. So I'm a little bit less like my personal passion and more about finding what is unique about us and getting energized about that. It's going to be a different chapter, and just embracing that. So I think the time away helped me reflect a little bit about like what's important in work and life, and like also not trying to get all my meaning out of my work. I've got a family, I've got kids, like I can end my day having a really bad day at work, and I'm much more likely to just close the laptop and it doesn't bother me. Whereas I think early in my career, a bad day at work would really bother me. Like if I had a tough conversation with a boss, or, like I just feel like we let someone down, it would just bother me. I would bring it into the next conversation. I'd just be like, I wouldn't have the same mojo. And I'm much more short-term memory now. I can just forget something and move on. Like, okay, well, next up, like next project, next conversation, gotta show up right here.
It's a really interesting take on like the pet projects versus actually like what the business needs. One of the things that I've noticed over the course of the last, call it 5 to 7 years, is the business need and employee expectation, that like the gap actually feels like it's getting bigger. I thought like, this correction over the course of the last 18 months was going to narrow that gap. I don't know if that's actually happening right now. I'm curious to see like what you're actually seeing and then how you're thinking about that.
Yeah, the gap between like what employees are expecting and sort of like what employers are expecting.
Exactly. And what employers need to build real businesses.
Yeah. I think so. Just if we rewind the mode that we just come out of, so great resignation, super employee friendly market, companies really twisting in all sorts of different directions to give things, to sort of relinquish control, to trust more, work from anywhere, do all these things, have all that you want, and because they kind of had to compete. And then, amidst that, not all sorts of great things were happening when you think about social isolation and like people burning out, parents like struggling. And so companies are trying to give more. It wasn't always translating to like better mental health or outcomes for employees. And then, the great resignation, people moving in different directions, and then a hard pivot, like, whoa, timeout, VC money has gone away. And now it's back to the employers. The employers are maybe like thinking, gosh, we screwed up. We're trying to pivot now hard to correct the other way. Return to office, layoffs, cutting things, and so the gap is still there. It's just kind of gone in a different direction of the gap. And I deal with these questions. I'll deal with these questions in all hands. Like one question, like, are we having layoffs? To like, when am I going to get my pay increase? And sort of like this. Like, whoa, the same question just right after the other, or this question right after that question. And there's this dichotomy, I think, for employees also. The gap, I think, is increasing. And where I see it is like employers maybe sometimes operating from a mode of fear of like, we've given away some things. I'm fearful of the headwinds. I'm fearful of the economy. And like, I'm just kind of going to react to, I'm just going to do what others are doing. I'm looking at fellow co-founders. I'm going to do what they're doing. I'm just going to play it safe. And I think you have to continue to sort of bring leaders together to talk about how are we going to create a high performing workplace? Let's try and block out all the noise. how are we going to create a high performing workplace? How are we going to create execution and like a humming machine? How are we going to do that? Is that about returning to the office, or is it about other things? Like, what is the data telling us in our survey results? It's people are misunderstanding the strategy. We got to somehow fix communication internally. We got to create a beat of communication from leaders to mid-level managers down to employees, and create more sort of beats that can translate to wins, that sort of like start to perpetuate in terms of like people are seeing what we're doing is working. We can block out noise externally. What we're doing is working. And there's a beat there, and it's starting to feel good, and it's starting to translate to later things like incentives or things that we can kind of give back to the workforce that are earned, as opposed to previously I was beholden to give you these things, and then I felt beholden to take them away, and now we're giving them back because they've been earned. So
the divergence is something I've seen and felt too, especially over the last 2 to 3 years. It's just really difficult, to get everyone on that same page. 4 years ago was kind of like the market's good, people are making money, everyone was kind of rising tide lifts all boats, happy for the most part. I have a hypothesis, and I wanted to ask you if you'd agree, and advice for the audience, that the generational differences has created a lot of different viewpoints, reactions, points of view, preferences on what employees think employers should be doing, shouldn't be doing, understanding this phenomenon that's going on in the market, because many have never seen it before, right? So my question is, do you agree there is just deviations of different generations now all put together going through this? And what are some tips on how to get all those folks coalesced?
Yeah, I was just at an event where we talked about this, and we talked about, is the generation entering the workforce a me generation, or is it a we generation? Or are we just misunderstanding it? Like, one generation is misunderstanding what the generation entering the workforce wants. And so we had people from each generation in this meeting talking about this. And what we acknowledged was there's definitely something going on around isolation and individualism that can even be translated to performance reviews. Performance reviews exacerbate individualism. They don't perpetuate team-based sort of community building. And I think for people leaders, you got to recognize we're just coming out of a mode where like there was a lot of all for one, like I'm all about myself. And what we need to be doing is like team building and community building. And the generation entering the workforce actually wants that. So they don't want to be alone. And so like one of these individuals in this team said, like, you know what, you would think that you would read data that says the generation entering the workforce wants to be able to work from anywhere. They want to be left alone. They don't want to interact with others. And when we have opened up the offices optionally, this person sharing this anecdote, it was a generation that is entering the workforce that wanted to be around others. They want a community, and they want their employer to create a community that is worth joining. And that's very different than sort of individualism and isolation. So I think we misunderstand each other.
Agree. I had an employee tell me this last year. I said, we want the same thing that they want. It's just we don't want to be told when and how and where. We literally want it. We just don't want to be told exactly, prescriptively, what to do.
It's super interesting. You mentioned performance, and I want to spend some time on performance with you. Right now, I'm hearing from founders that like performance is under the biggest microscope that they've ever seen. They care deeply about high performing cultures, making sure that everyone in the company is performing at a high level. And given now that like layoffs are still like really like the talk of Silicon Valley, and companies are still doing a lot of cuts. And I think really underneath those cuts are like performance management that hadn't been happening for a couple of years. What's your take on like, how do you measure the success of an employee? Like, what is high performance to you?
Yeah. Well, I think you can create different definitions around it. You could say, are you meeting expectations, occasionally exceeding it? And that's like solid. You could say you're exceeding expectations because you're delivering some impact that was not expected. And then you're not meeting expectations. I think you can define it different ways. I mean, Kelly's certainly seen this. So like, we just sort of go back and forth, like we wordsmith, language. And where a lot of the muscle building around performance management is in particularly early stage companies that are building a muscle around this and we're getting more mature is around calibration and alignment and sort of honesty, like honesty internal, like, being able to talk specifically amongst each other on our teams, or when we're seeing high performance, when we're seeing low performance, and like what is happening there, and depersonalizing it. And so usually I'd say early stage companies are not good at, number one, they probably don't have a great definition. So like the table stakes to get a definition, but then they're not great at calibration and alignment and talking about it openly in a way where it's not going to offend everyone. To talk about it, to find ways to sort of like, hey, that was great. Why was it great? What was the impact that it had? That was not great. What is at the root of that? And I think if for leaders, if I'm a founder or if I have a leadership team and like there's an outcome that's positive for this, it's not having a spreadsheet that is all the ratings at any given time and we see it and we have an action item. I remember dealing with a founder whose goal was to have ratings so that there's an action off to the right. So we know if we're letting this person go, or they're going on a performance plan, or we're promoting them or whatever. And like, I don't think that's your outcome. Ultimately, your outcome is something that I think a lot of companies don't think about in performance cycles, which is the team. So performance reviews for individuals has a value for the individual so that I know I'm clear on where I stand. It's not a mystery anymore. And like between me and my boss, we've broken through the honesty barrier and like, okay, I get it. I disagree with it, but I get it now. And so I know what's being asked of me. I can choose to stay here, be a part of that or not. Leaders then can kind of calibrate and say, I see where individual performance, I see what that means in high performance. But ultimately, you launch a product, you change a service, you sort of derive revenue, you derive like margin performance through teams, through the effectiveness of teams. And we could go through entire performance cycles where the team-based view of performance is totally obfuscated. So we said this team is like, 4 of these 5 individuals are high performers. But the view of that team is the complete opposite. That's a dysfunctional team. And like, yeah, those are all rock stars, but I don't get anything I need from this team. And like, I see your dilemma there, that you've got some high performers. It's like, I have an orchestra of these are all like virtuoso soloists. But I need them to perform as an orchestra. Then I need them to make music together. Or these individual sports athletes, these baseball players are like, wow, they're phenomenal, but they're horrible as a team. And so I think founders need to come out of performance cycles, or leaders need to come out of performance cycles with increasingly a view of the team performance. And I think that's like really not done well in individual performance reviews. You have to have a completely different conversation. You could literally let's stack rank our teams. What are the high performing teams of this company? What are the low performing teams of this company? And why? What's at the root of that? Is that the leader? Is that something they're not set up for success? They're not positioned well? And we can make those adjustments that has much greater impact to the organization than just, making sure we have performance reviews in place for everyone.
Have you done that? Like, have you tactically like started at the team level, like with, as it relates to your performance cycles and how you run them? Like when you're thinking around, okay, like let's do calibration, let's calibrate on the team before we calibrate on the individuals. Like, how does that tactically work?
And do people get it? Like, I mean, I'm having a little bit of a hives thinking about wrapping middle management's heads around this concept, which makes total sense, but curious on how you work through that.
Yeah, I've done it probably the past 2 companies. And I'll talk about like Eventbrite. We showed a difference of the percentage of high performers. Like this team over here has the highest percentage of high performers. This team over here has the lowest percentage of high performers. So the highest percentage of highest percentage of low performers, highest percentage of high performers. And then we asked the executive team, is this right in terms of these teams? Like the team, like your view of these teams, that's the high performing team, that's the low performing team. Like, no, it's completely opposite. No, like that manager over there is being honest. They're being way too honest. That is not a low performing team. I'm surprised that's the team that shows up as our lowest performing team, just because the manager has marked a lot of their individuals as not performing, or they've kept a very high bar for high performance. That's not accurate. That's not an accurate view of our teams. And that's not an accurate view of our high performing teams. And so what happens from there? There's a sort of message back to the leader of like, timeout. There's something not right here. You can't come out of this cycle with like that view of your team-based performance, because that's not the perspective of your team. And there's this light bulb moment of like, oh, so that's not showing up well then to the next level, right? So I'm not showing up well as saying, oh, these individuals are high performing. I didn't realize that's the perspective of my team. No one's debating me that those individuals are great. They don't even know. They don't even know some of these individuals. But my view has now been challenged of my team just because we had that conversation. So then you could do it without the data. You could do, when we did at my last company, we stack ranked the teams. We said, what are the low performing teams, what are the high performing teams, independent of what the manager said. And then that was an output back to those leaders of, hey, just so you know, your team is viewed as one of the highest performing teams in the company. Just so you know, your team is viewed as one of the lowest performing individuals, lowest performing teams of the company. And then what does that do for the leader going through the cycle? Like, I need to make some changes. I need to make some changes that are not just, I need to deliver a tough message to you. I might need to make some like organizational changes. And then that starts to unlock a lot more in my experience than just, okay, we got through a performance cycle.
Hey, everyone. We'll be right back in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
Hey, everybody. Your co-host Nolan here. High performance and great culture should never be at odds. They're better together. With Lattice People Management Platform, companies efficiently run people programs that create enviable cultures where employees want to do their best work. Serving thousands of customers of all sizes globally, Lattice helps everyone work better together. Learn why companies from Slack to the LA Dodgers choose Lattice. Visit lattice.com/HRheretics today. That's Lattice, LATTICE.com. Have you ever had a negative experience hiring an executive? I certainly did at Carta and DoorDash, and that's why I started Continuum, the modern AI-powered executive search firm. Continuum connects executives and senior operators to venture-backed tech companies for fractional and full-time roles. You could post any executive-level role to Continuum's marketplace and search through our database of world-class experienced leaders. Continuum will intelligently surface your opportunity to relevant operators. They'll express interest and show up in your inbox. It's like magic. There's no platform fee or hidden cost. You only pay the person you hire, and you can cancel at any time. If you're thinking about hiring an exec in the middle of a search right now or don't know how to solve a problem, I get it. Scaling is hard. Companies like Athletic Greens, Weights and Biases, Masari, and more than 100 other tech companies have turned to Continuum for help solving their people ops, go-to-market, engineering, and finance challenges. So check out Continuum in the description below. Ping me on LinkedIn if you have any questions, or head to joincontinuum.com.
So tough economy right now. Efficiency is the bottom line is the new top line in a lot of ways. A lot of cultures are being now called soft cultures, right? If you're trying to save money, the first thing you do is crack down on the folks that aren't doing well. And so that's forced a lot of companies to have to be more transparent, right? If they're turning out the juice on their performance management systems now based on the macro, maybe they didn't even have one before. It's forcing them to now talk about this new thing and be more transparent with their practices in the organizations. What advice do you have for folks listening around that? What are the core elements? If you're going to be transparent, you can't boil the ocean and go from 0 to 100. What do you be transparent about, right? How do you start to talk to the company about this if you really haven't been doing it openly the past 2 or 3 years?
There's a quote from the pandemic. I remember, I forget who said it, but the job of a leader through uncertain times is to add more truth in the world. And so truth is not spinning. Truth is, here's what we know, here's what we don't know. And so I've seen this multiple times at startups where you get out of an all hands and it's like the feeling is like things are great. And it's like, what happened? Why did we blew that messaging? Things are not great. Like we went through a whole all hands and we gave this rosy picture. And okay, I don't want to freak people out. I want to give them information, the right people at the right time with the right context. I need to make sure you understand where the problems are in the company and who's working on it so you can support those individuals. And if we don't have a solution to this yet, you at least are aware that this is a big problem for us. And over here, we're seeing gains. Here's the wins. And we keep a consistent scorecard. So we're not sort of creating a new scorecard every month and every all hands of like, oh, this is important now. And then what about that last thing that we said was important? So what you know and what you don't know. So truth is what you know and what you don't know. Keep it as simple as possible. Right information to the right time, right people at the right time with the right context. So it's not about sort of, I'm going to open source all Google Docs at the company and like you get to see all the sort of, the gnarly stuff, because that's just going to disrupt people and make them unnecessarily worried. And I think you have to normalize some topics, normalize and sort of destigmatize some topics that might freak people out. So we have to normalize like some terms that maybe previously, like we didn't use those terms. We didn't use sort of like we have to perform at a high level. We didn't talk about how our performance cycle and our comp cycle is really about rewarding high performance. It sounded like it was rewards for everyone. And now we're saying something different. And we've got to normalize some of that language, which feels like maybe a little bit less soft. Maybe it feels like a little bit more like it's going to be hard. We're going to normalize it's going to be hard. We think there's rewards for it. We're going to normalize the scorecard that we use, and so it's more predictable, and treat people like adults. So
on the normalization front, so like, are you normalizing like terminating employees after performance cycles? Like, is that one of the things that you're trying to normalize?
I think it's already pretty well understood, but I think it's less about sort of normalizing that could happen, because I think that probably feels like holding something over someone's heads. Like that could happen. That can happen. But what we want to make sure people know in the performance, like I just got out of these conversations, we want you to know where you're standing relative to expectation. We want it to be absolutely clear. You know what's expected of you. Because sometimes, in startup land with like a green manager, I'm kind of like, I'm working my way through this. I don't really know the right language to use. It just gets totally unclear. It gets totally unclear. Am I doing well? Am I not doing well? I mean, it can get unclear in all hands. Like, whoa, we didn't share some stuff we should have shared there. And so the normalization is more of the language. So you just know that, like, I'm just going to be really honest with you. You're doing well on this. You're not doing well on that. I don't think it's going great. So, but here's what you can do. Here's what you can do to improve things. And that feels like a shift to me, like in some prior companies, like in the Great Resignation. I don't think that the performance cycle was maybe in some companies a little bit more about, I want to make sure you feel good. You're motivated. You're motivated to just stay here,
Yeah. Really quick on that. I've talked to a few founders and a few peers, right? Chief people officers that have kind of said this macro has given us a little bit of license to be a bit tougher and to send harder messages than previously, right? In the spirit of retention and keeping you happy and all these things. So do you think the pendulum has shifted a bit on this side? And what do you think about that?
Like, I think the sort of like finding your inner Elon or whatever, it is probably not the mode for most founders. Like, you got to find the voice that works for you, that is like really direct and clear. The license to sort of take things away, or the license to, like it's if it's going to make you a fundamentally different person than what's your strong suit, like strength-based leadership development is like, you have a certain strength, you should like let that shine at the workplace. If your strength is not sort of margin performance, but that's your CFO's strength, let them own that conversation. Let them do that. And so I think founders need to be kind of careful about sort of, I'm going to be a different person. I'm going to use this to be a very different person. The reality is most people are going to like unlock higher levels of performance. Number one, by knowing what's expected of me, so that I can overachieve. So I know what's expected of me. So now I know what I have an idea. I have an idea on something. I'm going to go push this idea. I'm going to try and drive this impact. And my discretionary output is coming from some intrinsic motivation. And so it's much more likely that for many people, it's going to have to come from within. I just know what's expected of me. My boss has been clear. But if you as a manager know what someone's motivators are, you probably know more of what to do, buttons to push to help that person get to the next level of performance, versus, being hard with them, or versus, taking something away, versus being sort of strict or something, which is unlikely to create some game-changing performance for your company.
Yeah, I agree. And the consistency is going to be important, right? So the last thing I'll say, and I'll let Nolan shift us, but in good times or bad, right? That adventure, that brand of that founder, that brand of that CPO, right? I mean, you're very well known for empathy and holistic, I mean, that will follow you and the market will go back up at some point. So that thrash is very dangerous. And to think through that for the long term is important.
Yeah, just to piggyback off that, I feel like a lot of founders right now are forgetting that their recruiting brand is always at stake. And like, even though you may not be hiring right now, if your business does well, you will start hiring again. And I think people have very long memories on some of these topics, which like actually kind of brings me over to comp. So we've been talking about performance, and I just want to get your take on like tying comp to performance in today's world. I think there's a lot of companies right now who are surprised that the comp data has not dropped as much as they would have expected. Carta just put out a bunch of data recently. It does look like base salaries have come down a little bit. Equity, as it relates to early stage companies, is down pretty significantly, which I think is somewhat surprising. How are you thinking about comp, and how are you advising on compensation right now?
So our compensation strategy really is about almost entirely allocating it to high performance. I don't know if that's right for every company. And it's like, I think every all hands I've had to answer this question, the past two all hands, past two or three. I think it's unique because I think in general, there's a sort of like everyone gets everything approach. We're kind of slightly sort of amending it, but like we want to make everyone happy. For us, at least, we have a very difficult path that we've just been on. We have like really meaningful growth that we think is coming up. We think that there's a small like cohort of individuals in the company that are having like outsized impact. We want to reward them. Like we know that in general, merit cycles have been, you get 3%. And if you're crushing it, you get 4.5%. And it's like, there's nothing here that you're doing anything for anyone, that is anything to do with a performance reward for people. And so, at least for us right now, we'll see how it happens. We'll see how it all pans out. We're trying to really reward high performance for people having outsized impact on the company. It's kind of, like if you read Instacart's S1, it's kind of, that's the spirit of it. And it's the spirit of what many public companies try and tell their shareholders, but we're trying to make it really happen like in a real way. So, and I don't know if that's right.
Like how aggressive? Yeah. Like what percentage of the population is considered a high performer? And are you saying that like, if you're just meeting expectations, you should not expect an increase?
Yeah. Yeah. And so like, and this is like a whoa, like moment, I think for many people, but like our average tenure is about a year. Many of us are still learning in our jobs. Like I haven't hit a year yet. I'm not expecting anything. Many early stage startups, like how much of track record have you built at the company? What have you been able to do so far? And so your experience in a performance cycle is about learning how you're doing, what's expected of me, what could crushing it really look like? And so I want to make sure you're not expecting anything. The idea of battling entitlements at the company, or any startup, it's out there, your entitlement is out there. And so what should I expect? Don't expect anything. Don't expect anything. Expect that you're going to learn how you're doing. And there's a path for you. We believe everyone can crush it. We believe you're not going to be here if we don't think that you have the potential to actually perform at a little bit higher level. Everyone can get to exceeding performance level. And so it might be year one, it might be year two, it might be at some point. And when you do it, we want it to be really meaningful. And so you've been rewarded, and you've learned what that high performance is like. And so if you're meeting expectations, you're getting a good feedback session with your boss.
I think that is new.
And if people don't like it, they can vote with their feet.
I'm telling you that this is HR Heretics is the title of this podcast. That is something that is, I think, shifted very quickly, like literally within a cycle. This year is that meets is the new nothing. Not that you're bad, and that's a nuanced thing to talk about. That meets isn't bad, but don't expect it. And I agree with it, but that is new.
So give me one click deeper here. I'm fascinated by this topic. So say we identify the top performers, and say a manager has 2 or 3 on their team. How much discretion are you giving that manager to do they have a slush fund that they can allocate however they wish? Or is it like, hey, the model produces like this amount of increase for each person and you lock them in? Like, how do you guys think about discretion versus the model?
We're giving the judgment to the manager, and then their boss kind of aligns with them. Like there could be a little bit of things that are thrown out of whack on internal parity, but like in general, we're giving them. There's not a budget, so it's not a use it or lose it. It's a sort of like we say, hey, we think this is what meaningful means. It's a lot more than an average salary increase year over year. Average startup salary budget. It's a lot more than that. And here's what we would recommend, and it's a starting point. But we allow them to plug it in, and there's not a budget. There's not a sort of like, I don't have enough dollars for this high performer over here. It's plug it in.
On the comms. So like disproportionately rewarding top performers, I think is like what founders have been talking about and asking for. And it sounds like you guys are actually starting to deliver that. How do you make sure that the manager is delivering the right message to that top performer to make sure that they feel it? Because it's one thing to say like, hey, we're doing this. It's a whole other thing to be in the seat receiving it. Like, how do you make sure that they know that they're a top performer?
There's a couple different touch points. I think there's the calibration touch point. There is hearing it from other leaders. Like, here's the impact. We ask for clarity when you go through this calibration, and we sort of pull out a few high performers. What was the impact? What did they do? And then sometimes when it feels like, it sounds like you're just saying they worked hard, but I don't understand what the impact was. No doubt they worked hard, but I don't know if that's high performance. Okay, that's good clarification. This person over here had a game-changing effect on sales funnel conversion. Like they shipped this thing and no one asked them to do that. And like, that's kind of what we want to see, right? We want to see people sort of leaning in and sort of fixing the problems that we have. And like, no one asked them to do it. That's game-changing impact. And so then they get to hear that in the feedback cycle from their other leaders, from their next level boss, but the business partners. So I have a couple of really amazing business partners who are digging into this. They're reading it. They're reading the feedback. They're sitting down to coach more junior managers. It's a huge role for the business partner. However many you have, it's a huge role for them. And I sort of, toot my own horn to my business partners. I got a couple of really good business partners who get this part of their impact with their teams they support.
Yeah, we literally had, for that top echelon, the CEO wrap their arms around these people. It could be literally a note to their house or an email or an in-person or a 15-minute Zoom, anything to kind of come over the top and piggyback on that great feedback. That subjective qualitative touch was something that it was really important. So
I love that.
One of the things that I learned when I was at Google, and it was kind of like on the hush hush streets, is that there used to be this notion of a founder grant. And so like for the really top decile performers, not only would they get like all the comp and the praise, but then they'd get like a specific grant that was from the founders, like Larry and Sergey had signed off on. That was obviously like, huge, and that made them feel great, but also the notion that it can't, like Larry and Sergey signed off on this thing. And so I love that idea of like making those people feel super special, because that's how you tuck them in, and that's how you continue to get the type of performance from them. And then hopefully from everyone else, they see that and they're like, I want to be like that person. Let's transition into advice for founders. So one of the questions Kelly and I get all the time from founders is around chief people officers. Founders don't know what to expect. And so like, I'm curious from your lens, how do you assess a people leader?
Yeah, I think about a people leader is doing really well if they're balancing three things, which is strategy, execution, and relationships. And I think some people leaders have a brand of, or they have like their strength is in one of those. They are a people person, and so maybe the founder has decided, I'm putting you in that role because you've shown the greatest knack at our culture and insight on that. And however, they struggle to sort of think about the strategy is for people at this stage in our maturation of the company, and how all the pieces have to fit together to pull that strategy off. Relationships part, so strategy, relationship, and execution. Execution is, can I actually do the work involved in the strategy? Do I know how to actually stagger these? How do I prioritize these things so we can do these effectively? And so I think you're trying to assess your people leader. Are they right for you at this stage of your company in terms of their competency of being able to do all three things? and knowing when to switch. I might have to start with building trust. So that's relationships orientation. I'm going to start my time now with the company on building trust and sort of stakeholder, kind of like inputs, like, kind of do a roadshow, understand what are different needs, what is the conflict, what is sort of different opinions that are diverging on the people team right now, and kind of what we're doing. Build that trust, then move into execution on near-term stuff. Before I get to the strategy level, I need to execute on the performance cycle and the comp cycle, just to build some of the trust from the leaders who've been burned by their people leader in the past. And then finally, I can enter this strategy conversation. I can sort of talk about what I think our next year plan should be, what some big things, some big rocks that we should be pulling off, and how those are going to have to be done with the leadership team as opposed to just me in isolation. So I think a good people leader has to balance all three things. And much of it is about co-ownership of people and culture with the rest of the leadership team, as opposed to owning it fully. And that's another thing that I think is important for a good people leader.
Yeah. David, you just said burned by the people leader in the past, right? And I'm not saying this is the case for every company, but it does happen. What are the main situations you've seen when a new people leader is coming in to kind of clean up a mess? What has usually happened? What is underneath that? And how does that new people leader turn that ship around, if that makes sense?
Where do people leaders fail? Like, where do you see people leaders fail? And then how, like, if you are coming in, how do you get that ship back on the right track?
And what do you hear? Oh, the other people leader did this or didn't do this. I mean, what are those big buckets of things that go wrong?
When I started talking with some founders, it was probably about last summer when I was coming off my sabbatical. I was wound up talking with a lot of different founders, and half of them were the situation of the prior people leader didn't work out, for whatever reason. They were exited, or they left, and it was not a good situation or whatever. A lot of it was just a misalignment, some misalignment in where they were spending our time and where we were seeing the impact. A misalignment around also what we wanted from our people leader. So this person was comfortable being behind the scenes and like not being an open and sort of upfront people leader. They didn't want any airtime at the all hands. They didn't want to spend time, they were in the office, but they didn't want to spend time with people. So there was a disconnection. The misalignment was disconnection with the workforce. The misalignment was disconnection with the board. The misalignment was they really had the trust of the employees, but they just could not get aligned with what we wanted as an executive team. And so misalignment is usually the core of it. And sort of like they had some alignment on something, but there was something else there that was broken. And it's tough. It's tough for people leaders because you're balancing all these different interests. How do I have trust and respect and credibility with the employees, but not be sort of seen as like at odds with the executive team? How do I have trust line with the executive team, but not be seen as just a company person, and like I'm not sort of the rest of the workforce I don't get them, And so that's a balancing act that at the root of it, some level of misalignment was the issue for the people leader who was no longer there.
I could not agree more. I mean, at this point, I talk to founders a lot, and it's less about whether that HR leader is good or bad functionally. It's more of the fit with that organization, right? It kind of aching us all to crayon of crayons, and we're all crayons. There's just different colors. You got to find the right color that fits that culture. Otherwise, it's just going to miss. So I agree with you that it is hard.
David, what do you do to stay aligned? Because you mentioned the competing interests. So like typically like the founder has, some things, the employees have a lot of things, the board has something, the leadership team has other things. Like there are so many parties to navigate as a chief people officer. Like how do you make sure that you're in alignment with all of those competing interests
and stay sane?
Yeah, it's a good question. So number one, it's not about boiling it down to something that like no one would disagree with, right? It's not about meeting everyone's needs all at the same time. But there is some level of trust. So I need to be trust and respect. You might not like what I'm focusing on, but I trust it because you've been highly communicative with us. I respect it because you can share the context, you can share the why. Why are we doing this now? Why are we not doing this now? And so that trust and respect is the core of that is a relationship that you can't build with everyone in the company, but that I can get out there. I can get out there as much as I possibly can. So when I go to Tel Aviv, do Ask Me Anything, I really want people to ask me all the tough questions. And I want to not dodge any questions. I want to be able to spend time with, whoever is influential in the office who gets the culture. I want to go out and ask them questions. I want to learn from them. I want to be lean with curiosity. I don't think that I'm going to win any sort of trust and respect competitions by just being didactic. I really need to ask questions and root out and make sure I understand what's going on in the workforce. You get some of that through engagement survey results. You get a lot of that through conversations. And so I think in moments in my career where I feel like I have been disconnected, like I've been missing something, because I've been too comfortable with my team. It's been like I haven't gotten out there. I haven't talked with leaders. I haven't sought out the people who oppose the people team, or sought out the people who are critics of the people team, sought out the dysfunction and really immersed myself in it. So I try and run to the tough stuff, wherever it's happening in the company, and understand it so that then I can speak to it credibly. This is why we're not doing this now. This is why we are doing this now. So that why, that context, I think, I had a business partner told me the other day, I was talking through our compensation cycle approach. She's like, you missed the why. Like, all this is good stuff, but there should have just been a slide on the why. I'm like, oh my gosh. Thank you for calling that out. So anyways.
I love the idea of running towards the folks that are not in agreement with your philosophy or your strategy, or made feel like a little bit slighted in some way. It's one of my bigger learnings being in the role, is that it's so easy to anchor on the people that agree with you and that see your way of the world. But actually, it's less about winning them over and more about making sure that they feel heard and understand why we are doing things. If I could go back, I think that that's probably one of my biggest regrets in my last job, is that I didn't spend enough time with the people who disagreed with our approach and philosophy, because it feels way safer to hang out with the people that agree with us.
Yeah. And to your point on the why, it's just talking to them like a human, right? I don't care if it's me to an SDR or me to a board member. Again, that reputation, that consistency of, I'm going to just talk to you simple. Here's why not. You might not like this, but here's the deal. And that reputation spreads like wildfire, especially with the detractors, right? You connect with a detractor, they're going to tell 50 people, versus a promoter, they're going to maybe tell 5. So could not agree more with both of you.
And I think another thing that's been particularly helpful for me in my current stint is I've just been really deeply curious about the business, how it works, immerse myself. The cliche is be a business leader first, and sort of your people strategy second. Understand what the business needs are. Hugely helpful for me. And earlier in my career, I some the SDR function, sales funnel conversion performance, whatever, just eyes glaze over earlier in my career. And now I'm super curious about it, and I can speak credibly to the current state of the business because I can quickly connect to people stuff in terms of why back to the business. Anyways.
Do you have advice for those folks that are trying to get into that number 1 seat for the first time and having a hard time doing it? I'm literally talking to 3 right now that are banging their head against the wall because they want the CPO role, and all they're hearing is, we want someone who's done it before.
Part of what I would say is one of my most miserable experiences in my career was my first head of people role. It's no longer even on my resume. I just made a huge mistake. I thought I wanted something for a particular reason, and I just it wasn't what I wanted at all. And so I think that there's a desire early on. I need that top job. I need this for some reason. And in terms of the patience to get there in the right situation with the right person who's going to grow you, because when you're first time head of people, you're still learning. And the reality is many CEOs don't have time to develop you. Like CEOs are sometimes the worst bosses when you think about like, I'm going to develop you in my career. I want a boss who's going to develop me and like give me feedback and like, you're not gonna, like the CEO doesn't have time for that. And so when I deeply want that as my sort of career milestone, I got to be ahead of people. That might be the last time you're going to get the type of feedback that you want to get. And so, in terms of your patience to sort of like that right situation is going to manifest itself at the right time. I think some of the best people leaders I know took them a while. It took them a while to get to that job. And suddenly the first job was CPO of an amazing company. And they were in for 20 years doing something underneath someone else. And now they're doing phenomenally. Whereas, I was itching at it like 10 years in. I need to get it. I'm like 10 years in my career. I need this job. And then I flounder. And then I'm like, man, I wish I don't have the development experience. I don't have the person developing me anymore. I kind of want to get back to that. I've had that conversation where someone's like, I think I need to go back to a number 2 job. I need to go back to someone. I need to go under a CPO at a public company who's going to develop me because I'm missing so much. So, that might not be the answer that they would want to hear, but I would encourage patience and just sort of like find that mode and wait for the perfect opportunity to surface.
And David, when you are in the top job as you are right now, as you mentioned, like most CEOs aren't great bosses. Like I'm terrible. I know that I've experienced that in the past. Like you just don't learn. You're not learning about your craft from the CEO. How do you continue to learn? Like what are your resources? What are you doing? Like how do you continue to stay sharp in your game?
I think at this point in my career, a lot of the fun and a lot of the sort of like, man, every day is a new learning is seeing how the executive team works together along with the board and what is the board focusing on and how do we get through this board meeting in a way that creates better alignment on the business itself? What are the pieces here? What must be true of talent for us to get to that place in that sort of fiscal year plan 6 months from now? A lot of it is that executive team dynamics, working with founders, working with the board, and then the business plan. How can I have a big impact on the business plan? I think I kind of know. We'll get through this performance cycle stuff. We'll get through this engagement survey stuff. Like I've done that before, but how are we going to make the business work on relative to all things people and talent? Constantly learning on that. No shortage of learnings.
Last question for you, David, is how you stay aligned with the founder. You've worked for generational founders. Founders, I think, are all over the place generally. I am now one. We have a million things going on in our minds. Oftentimes that, we get information, I think very quickly that the chief people officer doesn't get just from their seat and operating internally with the founder operating a lot of externally. How do you stay aligned with founders?
That's a good question. I think part of it was selecting out in the interview process. I think those who are probably wasn't going to work. Probably half the battle there is like, are we like when times are tough? Do I feel as though that we'll be able to work through stuff? Like we communicate in a way where we understand each other. Like there's a respect there. We kind of know what we're going to be looking for from each other. There's alignment there as much as possible at the beginning. I've been paired with a founder in the past where I just realized almost immediately I made a mistake, and it was going to be intensely hard to get alignment around the initiatives. And like I misread this person. And so I think with Rami and Itai, the founders of Flare, I think I just spent enough quality time with them in the beginning. Like I got them. I got why they care about the business. I got how they like to operate. I got like where they are going to spend their time, where they're not going to spend their time. As co-founders, what will I lean on this one for versus this thing over here? And then as much as possible, meeting them with their communication style. Like I'll give you one example. Early on, my last company, we were trained to have a document for every possible change in the company, like almost like call it like a run of show document, any possible change. Like here's an org change, here's the change over here. It's just how they rolled at my prior company. And I quickly saw that there was a much more loose approach to planning on big changes. My current company was just more and more startup-y, I guess. And so I adapted. I've tried to meet them where they're at. how they like to communicate and how they like to roll with things and how they like to keep certain things simple. Whereas my prior company, we complicated things. So, but I was fortunate that I think I got a lot of it just from the way I approached the interview. So,
David, thanks so much for the time. I learned a ton from this. I know our listeners are going to love it too.
Same. Thanks so much, David. It's awesome.
Thank you for having me.
HR Heretics is a podcast from Turpentine, the network behind Econ 102, Moment of Zen, and Turpentine VC. Subscribe, 5 stars, share it on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts, all the things.